take some glycine.
I'm actually gonna like move this whole thing back a bit.
Probably 47.
Okay.
Awesome, awesome. So here we are in Denver.
Yeah, ran into each other.
Ran into each other at the Psychedelic Science conference. This is a hotel room, extremely improvised, but we decided, as you put it, the internet required of us. Oh wait,
Yeah.
I'm off camera.
Oh, you're
Okay.
off camera? There we go.
Yeah, there you go.
Fine.
The internet required of us to essentially have a conversation. So here we are.
Yeah, it's come up quite a lot over the last few years, I've noticed. We've been interacting somewhat indirectly for like a decade now.
Yeah, disregard everything I say.
Yeah, I started
Yeah.
that blog when I was 17, and you were referencing some of the articles that I wrote in very complex blog posts that I did not understand at all. I was like, oh, okay, sounds interesting. No idea what's going on, but cool.
Okay, yeah. No, I thought like disregard everything I say was essentially like, I think probably like the best like phenomenology out there in the internet for substances. So I was like deeply impressed with that. And it was like a Tumblr, right, or something?
Yeah, it was on Tumblr, and then eventually I felt that the Subjective Effect Index project had outgrown a Tumblr blog called Disregard Everything I Say, so I set out to found Psychonaut Wiki, and it all just sort of expanded from there.
Okay, yeah. And that was like 10 years ago?
I think I founded Psychonaut Wiki in 2013, and
2013.
I left Psychonaut Wiki in 2017.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
so 6 years. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So at the conference, I guess like that's kind of like a funny thing is like in the booths area, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the like vending places. It's like, oh, there's like this little booth, and they say like, yeah, we've got like, you know, the best stuff. Like, what is it? Like, oh yeah, you know, mushrooms like reishi, lion's mane, cordyceps, and it's like, okay, cool. And you go like the booth right next to it is like, oh yeah, we've got the best stuff. Like, what is it? Like, yeah, reishi, cordyceps, lion's mane. And,
Yeah, there
and-
was a lot of that at the last conference I went to in Miami.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little bit like kind of excessive. It's just like how repetitively proselytized these mushrooms are.
Yeah. I mean, there's a huge variety of stuff at the conference, but there's also stuff that's like quite samey.
Yeah.
It's kind of just inevitable, I suppose.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and I guess it's also like the whole contingent of people doing like stroboscopic stimulation, which is, I mean, absolutely fascinating, of course. But then like the explanatory frameworks that are like talked about are very much of the sort of like still, even to this day, talking about like this is going to activate your pineal gland, and
Is that what they're actually talking about? They're bringing up the pineal gland?
yeah. I think right next to your booth, there's actually like a little company that's doing like stroboscopic stimulation. It's like benefits activating pineal gland.
I mean, that's a bit cringe.
I know.
Where are they getting that from? I guess it's just this vague notion that the pineal gland is responsible for all sorts of things that there's no evidence for, I guess.
DMT
Yeah.
stuff.
I mean, the stroboscopic vision stuff has... it's way more powerful than I realized. Like, when I tried it with you yesterday, I was experiencing incredibly distinct psychedelic geometry and straight-up figurative internal hallucinations of people walking past me in... Well, I was essentially seeing the conference floor, even though I was wearing the glasses. I was seeing people walking around. It was pretty intense. Yeah, it was like really taking me aback.
We can do a little bit of that if you're...
Okay, sure, I'm down.
Let's just get some of your commentary.
Okay, this is only the second time I've tried this.
Yes, so not the very first time, but you know, sometimes you get like you make the best phenomenological observations like on the first few tries, not necessarily the first one. So let's this should work. You know, so I didn't make these. You can buy these on Amazon. It's called Casino Mind Place. I've tried actually like a bunch of products. I'm not, you know, they're not giving kickbacks or anything, but like it's just like very well made and like pretty resilient. Like hundreds of people.
I'm definitely going to get one of these to play around with.
Okay, so this is 10 hertz.
Okay.
And I guess like according to like the QRI, Mimplex, and research, I mean essentially different psychedelics do tend to come up with different characteristic frequencies. Yeah. Okay, so this is 10 hertz with no phase. What do you think?
I mean, I'm seeing mild, spiky psychedelic geometry. It's kind of a repetitive pattern, sort of dark green thin lines superimposed over... I mean, I guess it's just a white background. I think that's the actual strobe light itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so the green part is being imposed on the color of the strobe light.
Okay. Yeah, this is eyes open, in case, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna do a phasing.
Okay.
So now it goes left, right, left, right, left, right.
Okay, so that becomes like a weird cubic grid? with like a 3D cube in the middle, like black and white checker marks, and then that sort of that pattern repeats outwards with 3D in the center and then like 2D as it goes around it.
Yeah. One thing you will notice, and this is kind of like an important insight, is that there is a correspondence between temporal frequency, essentially, you know, the hertz.
Okay.
And
so just how quick it is.
How quick it is, and spatial frequency, meaning how detailed the patterns are. That's actually a super, super relevant thing. Like, if you look, I'll show you actually in a book pretty soon, but essentially, you know, these like vibrating plates that you put like sand on and you kind of like vibrate with a speaker. They're called like Chladni plates. You know what I'm talking about?
Not really.
Okay. I'll show you what I mean, and we can also find like some videos online you can splice into these. But essentially, these are the resonant modes of essentially these plates. If you apply a low frequency, let's say like 100 hertz, is going to make like some like symmetrical patterns on top of it. But then if you apply something like 200 hertz, the patterns are going to be more detailed. There's just going to be more lines, and they're like the spacing between them is going to be smaller. So essentially, yeah, that's like pointing to like the correspondence.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay, you changed the setting. All right.
I changed the phasing.
Yeah. There was a specific pattern that was slowly building up, and it just
suddenly. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. It's doing something completely different now. Okay. Yeah.
All right.
I'm seeing Toad from the Super Mario games.
Okay. Nice. Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna take you to the.
Have you changed the color?
No.
Okay, so that's my brain.
Okay.
So I mean, originally when I was looking at it, it was like kind of just a pale white. Now it's looking like quite distinctly pink or sort of a purpley green. I guess it's swapping between multiple colors.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm seeing patterns right now, but I'm also seeing imagery embedded within it. I don't know why it's Nintendo themed. Probably because of the Toon Link. You just brought out the Toon Link. And I was like, okay, yes, Nintendo. All right.
So for context, everybody, so we're together here with Link and Leona, who are like recurring characters in Qualia computing, especially, you know, for like talking about like mind melding and like interfacing deeply with somebody else's consciousness, which I guess maybe something we're like doing to some extent here. So I thought it was thematic. All right, so let me take you to my favorite frequency.
Okay, there seems to be a sweet spot.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's like several kind of like interesting kind of like places that have like their own characteristic effects. 14 hertz, which I'm gonna take you now, essentially, for me, have like the highest level of complexity and intricacy. Essentially, kind of like fairly unstable patterns. So like you can navigate and generate, depending on how you handle attention, a lot of different things.
Okay, there's a lot going on right now.
Right?
Yeah. Is this the setting that you put me on yesterday that I said was phenethylamine-like?
Probably. Yes, I think so.
Okay. And the artwork that it was reminding me of, I couldn't remember the artist at the time, is Ben Ridgway, specifically. He has some sculptures, I could probably show it in the video edit, the geometry really reminds me of, and I don't know why.
Nice. I thought it was very interesting, actually, that you were pointing out that phenethylamines kind of like are like more sharp, like sharp and kind of like sharp edges and kind of like how do you describe them?
So with hang on, I might actually see a lot here. Okay, so with psychedelic geometry, I'm trying to describe geometry while getting overwhelmed with geometry. We have the detailed description, we have the leveling system, but there's also style variations, as in the different aesthetic manifestations that occur between different compounds, and that could be how angular the corners are versus rounded, how soft versus sharp the edges are, how colorful versus monochrome it might be, how zoomed in versus zoomed out it might be, fast versus slow moving, things like that. And the style variations of most phenethylamines, at least for me personally, and from what I can tell other people, this is pretty intense, tend to have, I guess, quite bright colors, but also sharper edges and pointier, more angular corners. LSD is the same way, but I think that often kind of culturally gets associated with more of a kind of a digital sort of a vibe. In comparison, a lot of tryptamines, say psilocybin or 4-DMT or whatever, tend to have softer, blurrier edges and more natural color palettes, and I think people kind of intuitively associate that with a sort of natural, more organic look. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, let's come back to that after.
This definitely does not remind me of tryptamines.
Okay,
this reminds me of lysergamides and phenethylamines, quite specifically.
You're also at the frequency range right now, which is like 14 hertz. That, according to the tracer tool, is closer to phenethylamines and lysergamides. So essentially,
that is interesting.
In the tracer tool, for example, I'm going to take it to 12 hertz, a little bit lower frequency. 2CB the median response is like 12 hertz. So like this would be, according to our tracer tool, this would be like the typical 2CB effect.
Okay. And is there a hertz that... I don't know if I pronounce it hertz. Is there a hertz within this that you would associate with any specific tryptamines, say psilocybin?
Yes, I'm going to take you to that, which is like 19.
Okay.
So 19 is like much more psilocybin-like. What do you think?
It's a lot faster and more chaotic. See, I don't know that I would associate this sort of geometric pattern with psilocybin.
How about this? I just changed the phase. Not even necessarily a geometric pattern, but more kind of like the vibe, like the speed.
I mean, the edges have become softer.
Okay.
Yeah, it has a... So I kind of think of geometry as being either algorithmic, like it's clearly based on some sort of mathematics like fractals or repeating patterns, like the sort of thing you could generate with an algorithm, and then abstract, which is the kind of thing that a person might paint, say like very kind of creative shapes that don't seem to follow any logic that I can identify.
Yeah.
And the geometry that's occurring within this is purely algorithmic. I'm not seeing anything abstract at all. Like the patterns are quite symmetrical, and they remind me of something a computer would generate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna take you to the frequency I associate more with a DMT, which would be around like 28 hertz.
Okay.
Around there.
That is interesting. See, it's become a lot less structured, I suppose. Like the resolution has increased to an extent that's almost detrimental because I'm so zoomed out. Like when you turn the resolution up too high on your desktop computer and you can barely read the text because it's really small.
Yeah.
That's what I'm seeing with this. So it's like, it's more detailed in a way, but I'm also further away from it, so there's less for me to sort of take in.
Yeah. Okay. And then finally, which is, I mean, I think 5-MeO DMT is in some sense, I mean, it does have like low frequencies. Actually, I think like 5-MeO DMT has kind of like an 8 hertz component, but it also has a very high frequency component, which is around like 38 hertz, about like 40 hertz. So let me take you there and see if there's any resonance. Okay.
To clarify here, when you're saying the hertz of a compound, what do you mean?
I mean the quality, like speed and spatiotemporal resolution of the vibrations on any modality, like whether it is like body vibration, audio, like audio strobing, kind of like sometimes you get kind of like this like echoing, like.
But how are you measuring that?
Well, in two ways. One of them is kind of like practicing with something like a strobe, like what you're doing right now, getting familiar with different frequencies, so that then when you encounter them in meditation or psychedelics, you can say like, that's like probably 16 hertz. That's like one method. The second method is like with a tracer tool, where like literally, like people on the internet are contributing, like, okay, like trying to replicate what the tracers look like, and essentially like there is this general pattern where phenethylamines are like around 12 hertz, psilocybin around like, 18, 19, LSD around 15, and DMT around 30.
Okay, so with the tracer tool, you can collect data from various people.
Yeah.
That seems like a much more objective way to do it.
And then there's like another way to use a strobe is very, very hands-on, which is like if you get, like for example, if you take psilocybin and then spontaneously start getting like a flickering pattern, very fast flickering pattern, actually what you can do is like in that moment, grab the strobe, not necessarily put it on, but just like look at it from the side and try it to match the frequency on the strobe with the flickering in your visual field. And that way you can say like, that flickering was like 19 hertz.
Okay. I mean, I can see that being plausible. I would want separate people to come to the conclusions independently, and then I would want the numbers averaged out between those individuals so you can have kind of like a general range.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
Because if one person reports a hertz, I would be skeptical that is the hertz of that compound, as opposed to that is the hertz of how that person responds to that compound. With the tracer tool, it seems a lot more objective.
Yeah. And
although both approaches are useful. I mean, obviously I document subjective effects and a lot of that is based on my own personal experience.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, essentially, yeah. Every measurement is going to be noisy, and you need like ideally a lot of data.
Mm-hmm.
And the tracer tool, we have like something like.
Okay, I'm taking these
off.
off.
Yeah. Well, the last thing is a.
Oh, geez.
That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah. Gonna. Yeah, it's such a challenge to speak with these. So.
Right, it's quite distracting.
Good job. Good job.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna go all the way down to 5. So like, transitions themselves are also quite interesting. Yeah, like.
You're right. Well, you're nodding out.
Well, okay, excellent. Well, thank you for participating.
Yeah, I'm definitely getting a pair of those.
Fantastic.
Have you tried sleeping with them on?
No.
You should try that.
Oh, interesting. I wonder what would happen. Yeah. Well, yeah. Sometimes I'm forgetting. I have forgotten that I have them on, like in meditation in particular. And like I enter like a state and I think like, wow, I didn't know I was this advanced. Meditation is like, wait, actually I have the strobe on.
Oh, okay, that explains a lot. I tried closing my eyes towards the end, and that actually changed how it looked quite a lot. And I wasn't sure if it was just that my brain was still doing it, or if the light was shining through my closed eyes. Because I used to mess with those online dream machines. They used to be like Net Liberty Dream Machine, and I would turn it on, close my eyes, and just put my face up to the screen.
Yeah,
and that was pretty powerful. Like very similar, although. That's on another level.
Yeah, I'm gonna take this off. I guess maybe the sound might.
Right.
Forgot about that. No, exactly. You can forget about it. You can. There's actually like eyes opens or closed are both very interesting. And actually, I have like there's like a different pair of glasses that is like brighter, but there's rather than kind of like a whole screen is actually just like a few LEDs at the center, and those are like optimized for like eyes closed. So I have like both because they're both interesting in different ways.
Oh, wait, different pairs of glasses or different settings?
Pairs of glasses. So this is the other one. You see, like there's a.
Maybe I'll give those a try tomorrow.
Yeah. Of course, anytime. Yeah. Okay, so I agree. I mean, essentially, like all of these still in terms of like data collection is kind of like I would say like fairly early stages. One of my missions actually for this conference, I had like 3 missions you could say, but like one of them was essentially to convince academics to like use the tracer tool in their studies. Why? Because it's like, well, I think it's pretty cool. Also, we would like get like much more like very well measured data. Like okay, like this was actually 15 milligrams of psilocybin, intramuscular or whatever, like actually pharmaceutical grade. But then also, I do think that the actual intensity and the frequency of the visual effects essentially is one way of quantifying just how high you are. It's one of many things. Right? Sometimes, like you might take a high dose of something, like LSD or whatever. I wonder if this has happened to you. For example, like sometimes you can have like really strong, overwhelming effects while having like relatively like weak visuals. Like sometimes the energy maybe concentrates elsewhere.
Yeah, that can definitely happen. I mean, there are a lot of people that go through ego dissolution experiences and they don't really seem to be capable of experiencing visual effects at all. Yeah. I know one person who's a prominent psychedelic artist and he has aphantasia. He cannot visualize things at all. He's an unbelievably talented artist, so I guess he just like visualizes externally on a canvas somehow.
Yeah.
But when he takes psychedelics, he doesn't experience any visuals.
Wow.
So I try to take it into account now when I'm describing the subjective effects of psychedelics, and not everybody gets visuals. I have a lot of people reaching out to me and they're pursuing visuals like they're the end-all be-all of the psychedelic experience, wondering why they aren't getting them, and it's just variations in neurology, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. I have noticed this correlation between aphantasia and like a relatively lower load of visual effects on psychedelia.
Yeah, some people with aphantasia still get visual effects, but I know a lot of people, or I've heard reports of a lot of people that have aphantasia and get much fewer visual effects. So I think it definitely correlates.
Yeah. Okay. So we were talking about like in what way we like our work intersects, in what way it overlaps, in what way it's different, and like I think like the internet might be curious to hear that conversation. So very happy to dive into that.
Yeah, I think that's probably something we should talk about. I mean, I'm only just figuring out what it is you guys are doing at all, to be honest. I mean, I have dyscalculia. I can barely memorize a 4-digit number, so whenever I read your blog post that have all these complex mathematics, I'm just like, I literally cannot comprehend this. I describe altered states of consciousness and subjective effects through words. That's how I think. I cannot do maths at all. I mean, I get the impression that I am documenting altered states of consciousness through simple communicable words that people can use as a sort of universal terminology set to discuss and describe things, and I want it to be as universal as possible. So I want researchers to be able to use the terminology set, and I want average people to be able to use it as well. Whereas I get the impression that you are mapping out these states through like complex mathematical underpinnings. I'm sure that's a massive generalization, but
that's not a terrible way of putting it. So here's how I would describe it. So I mean, first of all, absolutely. I mean, I think there's like enormous value in essentially generating vocabulary, like the subjective effect index, things that like you can give it to somebody on an academic setting, and they could actually describe what happened, which is like an enormous like improvement over something like the mystical experiences questionnaire, which the fact that it's still being used is honestly kind of embarrassing for
I like the MEQ30 as far as so I don't think it's a comprehensive ontology of transpersonal and mystical states, but it does measure whether or not somebody is going through a mystical experience. I guess when I think of like the factor analysis validated psychometric scales, there are ones I have problems with, like the 11D ASC, but the MEQ30 I think is pretty good. Yeah. It's not as good as it possibly could be. I've been actively communicating with Fred Barrett, who was highly involved with the development of that, and we're trying to flesh out like a much more detailed ontology of mystical states. Andy Newberg was involved in that as well. Some amount of that was in the mystical experience tier list video that I made, which was a bit of a shitpost, but does go into detailed analysis of the different states.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So I mean, and well, I mean, the value you're adding is like, other like very, very detailed phenomenological things, such as like symmetrical texture repetition or like object activation and like very fun things like that.
Oh yeah, object activation is a fun one. It's like the poltergeist effect.
No, what is it?
I mean, so when I think of object activation, I think of, it's somewhat common on delirium. It's like you look at an object and it does something. So say it's a microwave, the door might open and close, right? Or it might disassemble and then reassemble. The object is sort of activated as a 3D external hallucination to do something that's based on the thing you're looking at, and often it gets kind of like poltergeisty, I guess. So I don't know, a door might open and close, or something might. Okay. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I consider that like a subcomponent of external hallucinations.
Yeah, makes sense. There's like kind of like one place where like that happens. I think it's like probably rare, but like very high dose LSD. Have you had like object activation on very high dose LSD?
Actually not, only on deliriums.
Okay.
Which I wouldn't recommend.
No, I wouldn't recommend deliriums either. But like, I think like sometimes very high dose LSD can do like really spooky things.
Interesting.
Like like in Halloween, like what is it called? Like a pumpkin, like a carved pumpkin is like boom, actually like it's alive and it's actually doing things, like actually like has its
okay. So when I get hallucinations in my external environment on psychedelics, it's only ever sort of transformations and pareidolia enhancements. I would never hallucinate something external like a person standing there. That's always an internal hallucination for me. I've definitely heard people report that on psychedelics, but it seems to be less prevalent than internal hallucinations, which are more like dreamlike visions and such.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess like to continue the conversation on like the overlap or like in differences in approach.
That's what we were talking about. Tangents, right?
Don't worry. It's awesome. The ontology that you've pursued, I think it's amazing and an enormous improvement over like anything that is in academia. I mean, I'm sure it will be in academia. It's gonna be it's getting there exactly. The way I might kind of like approach this is so like one of the early qualia computing articles, probably like 2015 I think it's 2016, is called Algorithmic Reduction of Psychedelic States.
Okay.
And I can explain like what I mean by that. So essentially there's like various kinds of reductions, and in general, a reduction means you try to find a small set of kind of explanatory principles that when you put them together and you combine them, you can explain kind of like a zoo of complex effects.
Okay.
So Now,
So,
yeah.
overarching summaries?
Not exactly. Yeah, maybe, but like summaries could still be kind of like very semantic or conceptual, whereas like an algorithmic reduction is essentially trying to find like a few underlying mechanisms with like
Okay.
as simple of an ontology as possible.
Mm-hmm.
To give you an example, like I guess like in physics, like the fact that people discovered that the world is actually made of atoms, I would say that's like a kind of reduction. And of course, there's like the criticism of hey, like if you just want to break down the universe into a bunch of atoms, in some sense, like you're missing out like the whole because you're just like breaking it apart. It turns out actually you cannot just break down the universe into atoms because atoms interact in ways that generate what would be called holistic behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, like the way in which a molecule vibrates is actually a function of the entire shape of the molecule at once. And it's literally more than the sum of the parts. Like it really, like ultimately physics doesn't actually work as like balls and springs.
Mm-hmm.
Because actually you have like these electron clouds that like go through the entire molecule simultaneously, and you have like an attractor state of the entire thing at once. So that said, so in that sense, like the universe, you cannot do what would be called an atomistic reduction. Like you cannot actually just break it down into just atoms and say, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
But you can break it out into fields. Like one of the huge accomplishments of the 19th century was actually, realizing that electromagnetism can be explained in terms of fields interacting with each other and evolving according to differential equations.
Okay.
And that is still a kind of reduction. It's just not an atomistic reduction.
Right.
But you're breaking down this extremely complex set of phenomena that includes like lightning, electricity, magnets, compass, static electricity, all of these enormous diversity of things into just 4 equations and a description of the fields. And
Okay.
so that would be a kind of algorithmic reduction. And it's algorithmic because you're describing like how a process evolves. Likewise, what I try to do with psychedelics and consciousness more broadly, is can we find a very, very simple ontology, a very simple kind of like set of building blocks, and a way in which they interact in such a way that if you just, kind of like, how do you call it? Like you pull the crank or you...
Okay.
Yeah, you just like push forward with those interactions, you can derive...
So you're trying to find like the base underlying mechanism
Yeah.
that leads into sort of expanding complexity?
Exactly.
That makes sense to me. Okay.
Yeah,
I
so-
actually understood that.
Awesome. Yeah. So for example, like very early on, like I think in that article, I was making an effort to explain. I mean, I think like the visual, like effect index or Psychonaut Wiki at the time, I think the visual component had something like 55 like effects or something like that.
Yeah.
I think what I was trying to do at the time was, can I derive all of them just based on like 4 simple effects interacting with each other? And the 4 effects that I thought at the time that were kind of like the primary psychedelic effects, obviously I don't believe that anymore, but it's a good first approximation. It was tracer effects, symmetrification, then pareidolia, or like enhanced pattern recognition, and drifting.
Interesting.
And my thought is like, hey, things like scenery slicing or object activation or any of the other complex things, it's just like how those 2 things like put together interacting with one another. For example, like, hey, like symmetrification together with tracer effects, you get kind of these like tracers of symmetries that then can compound with each other, and you get kind of like these crystalline fractal structures. And like, it's not that there is like, fractals are like an inherent building block, is that when you combine tracers and symmetrification, you get fractals as an effect.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I have sort of, underlying hypotheses about how certain categories of effects might work, and they do all sorts of seem to stem from similar things, or at least a lot of them do.
Yeah.
Is that your current ontology of visual effects?
No.
Okay.
The
Because I would put drifting and tracers in the same category, or at least I think they stem from the same sort of neurological feedback loop of signals going through little loops and then just kind of degrading.
Yeah, that I think that is definitely getting closer. So the biggest update, I guess, like for people listening who want to kind of like dig into this rabbit hole, would be this framework. Actually, I made a presentation about it this year, which is called Psychedelic Thermodynamics, which explains psychedelic effects in terms of field behavior, kind of like electromagnetism. In the end, actually, it's going to be electromagnetic behavior, but right now, for the sake of explanation, actually, I want to say that I'm agnostic about it. But essentially, actually, the way I approach it is in terms of energy and how energy moves from one domain of experience to another. I could go into it. Maybe it's a little bit of a rabbit hole, but maybe I could provide a few of the kind of core
trying
ideas.
To explain like I'm 5.
Yeah. Okay, so here's why are soap bubbles spherical? It's a good puzzle, actually.
Because I guess the pressure is going out in all directions in equal amounts, I guess.
Yeah. So what would happen if a soap bubble was a cube, for example? Just
I assume the edge would cause it to pop, but I'm just basing that on vague intuition.
Imagine it's a little bit of a rounded edge, it's not
a little bit of a rounded
perfect
edge.
Cube.
Okay. Yeah. I assume that bubbles are pretty unstable and that they can only maintain structural integrity if they are relatively spherical, because if they're not a sphere, then there'd be uneven amounts of pressure placed on certain segments of the bubble, which, if it's very delicate, could cause it to pop.
Yeah.
I'm making this up.
No, this is getting there. So here's what is going on. Every point on the surface of a soap bubble is essentially trying to minimize its tension. So
okay.
It's less tense when it's actually flat. It's more tense when it's kind of curved, and when it's kind of has edges. So what happens is if you start out with a soap bubble that is in the shape of a cube, it's gonna have these regions that are very, very tense, essentially, and they will essentially propagate a little wave from there to try to essentially dissipate that tension. So what will happen is the bubble, or the soap bubble will actually start to wobble, because the more tense parts are gonna kind of try to spread that tension elsewhere.
Okay.
Now, if it's wobbling, it's gonna be interacting with the air around it, and it's gonna start to lose energy, essentially. And that means that as long as it has kind of these so if it starts as a cube, it has potential energy in the form of tension. Then it starts to wobble. That becomes kinetic energy. And then that dissipates that kinetic energy in the air via heat. Ultimately, it's kind of the heating of the air. And essentially, it will wobble until it cannot wobble anymore, because it has dissipated all of its energy. And then it turns out the state of minimum energy is going to be the perfect sphere, where it cannot wobble anymore on its own. So in general, physical systems follow these kind of general formula, that when you have regions with a lot of stored energy, this, could be in the form of stress, it can be in the form of tension, in the form of a lot of potential energy, or electric potential. They will try to dissipate that, and they will essentially do so as far as they possibly can, until they cannot dissipate it anymore, and that usually will be an equilibrium state. Usually the equilibrium states will have features like symmetry, because when you have symmetry, there's no region that has more stored energy than any other one, and so that's essentially a stable attractor. So, well, I'll let you a moment to process that.
Okay, yeah. So I was just thinking of the brain as it's usually being, I guess, the analogous equivalent of a cubic bubble.
Yeah.
In the regions, or the way it communicates with itself is uneven, but when you take a psychedelic, it starts to communicate with itself in ways that it didn't, or it becomes more interconnected in a more balanced way. And I was just imagining as the brain becomes more interconnected and every region is communicating with itself, it's kind of a more analogous to a spherical bubble, but I have no idea if that's what you're talking about. I was just visualizing that in my brain.
No, that's great. Keep trying to make sense of it in ways like that. So what would happen on a psychedelic, to a first approximation, I make the claim that every psychedelic, one thing it does is that it essentially activates internal sources of energy that energize your consciousness. Very similar to kind of the strobe, actually. Neurophysiologically, there's one account. I don't know if like this has been like fully confirmed, but like it was a good theory for a while. Essentially, the cortex functions as an inhibitory mechanism, and whenever the cortex,
in the prefrontal cortex,
no, like sensory, this, like for example, like the visual cortex.
Okay, right.
This is actually what it's trying to do is like predict the next input, and whenever it can predict an input perfectly, essentially you tune it out. Like in some sense, you only really experience the things that were surprising. Now, you know, neurophysiologically, the cortex kind of has like these like actual like inhibitory effect on the thalamus, and the thalamus is kind of like this like central hub with like all of the sensory input, it gets aggregated.
Mm-hmm. Is that where sensory gating happens?
Yeah. Essentially, yeah. So the cortex is kind of like gating, is like kind of like preventing the activation of the thalamus in every way it can, whenever it can like anticipate what's going to happen. So James Kent, maybe you've heard psychedelic information theory, PIT.
I remember reading that when I was younger and having the exact same problem I had with your book.
Okay.
I was like, okay, this seems interesting. I don't understand.
Okay. So he has this article called "The Control Interrupt Model of Psychedelic Action," where essentially, he kind of like has this idea of like, which is I think like neurophysiologically accurate. Like the cortex is an inhibitory mechanism, and essentially, you know, imagine that it's like sending like 100 signals per second to the thalamus to inhibit kind of like sensory input. Now something like LSD might essentially like block that inhibitory signal several times per second. It's kind of like interfering with that signal. So it's actually inhibiting an inhibitory mechanism. And as a consequence, the thalamus actually like ends up like propagating more energy, more information to the cortex. And essentially kind of like the balance, the new homeostatic level, the new kind of like balance of energy is one where the cortex and the thalamus are actually like more activated because there's like a failure to inhibit several times per second. And effectively, that ends up being something like you have like an internal strobe in your brain that is like actually like preventing the inhibition of like what you just experienced. And that would be kind of like a very low level physiological mechanism for like tracer effects. Now, tracer effects will generate kind of like this build-up of qualia, build-up of energy in your experience. And then there's like a lot of downstream effects of, how does your brain handle all of that extra energy? And that is where like psychedelic thermodynamics comes into place, which is, there's like this like extra energy that is trying to be dissipated. And in this theory, in the psychedelic thermodynamics framework, all of the crazy psychedelic effects are actually the result of that energy's dissipation process. Like the symmetries that you see are symmetries because actually the more symmetrical configurations are essentially energy minima. They are kind of the equivalent of the spherical soap bubble.
Okay, I'm having thoughts.
Yeah.
So I remember when I was analyzing the psychedelic experience a long time ago. As a teenager, I wrote an article called "A Scientific Explanation of the Psychedelic Experience," which I completely disagree with now. But it kind of summed it all up through reduced sensory filtering. I was looking into the thalamus thing as well, and I mean, I guess it explains a lot of increased visual acuity, heightened colors, tactile enhancement, like sensory enhancements and things. And I guess it's also related to people with autism that have sensory processing disorders because I think they have trouble doing that automatically in the same way that neurotypical people do. But no, I guess I was imagining increased input coming through. I guess it usually stops it either to save energy or to stop consciousness from being overwhelmed, or some combination of the two. When you're saying that energy has to go somewhere, do you think a reduction in sensory filtering is causing neurons to have too much or energy or signals, so they're trying to send it elsewhere, which would cause the brain to become more interconnected?
Yeah. To a first approximation.
Okay.
And
I mean, So I guess I think about the psychedelic experience a lot in terms of increased connections in the brain, especially with psychedelic geometry, and I think a lot of visual distortions can be explained through increased sensory connections in terms of feedback loops, and then also Yeah, I guess I always thought of sensory amplifications as being a different thing. Like the sensory gating is going down, but I guess maybe they could be related if that increased input has to go elsewhere, and that's leading into increased interconnection.
The interconnection. So essentially, well, there's a lot more to unpack, but like I'm thinking, like you said, like explain like M5. So whenever you do have kind of like an opening of a channel of communication between sensory regions, like and synesthesia and things like that, essentially those would be energy minima. They are again kind of the equivalent of the spherical soap bubble, in that like here the energy by trying to dissipate in this very complex system found, for example, that these like synesthetic experience of like audio and visual experience, for example, in a resonance, that is a kind of symmetry, that is kind of like symmetrical texture repetition, except that is like cross-modal, is like an interaction between the senses. And whenever you have kind of, like a stable synesthesia or something like that, that is going to be functioning as a way for the energy to get dissipated. And so essentially I think like, okay, like why do different psychedelics produce different kinds of synesthesia? It is because the different strobe frequencies that get activated internally essentially favor different types of energy dissipation mechanisms. I'm going to actually show you the Chladni plates.
Yeah, go for it. I was having thoughts about, I think that geometry is a form of synesthesia.
Yeah.
As in a form of mental synesthesia, so like complex signals are going from different regions of the brain and reaching the visual cortex and then being reinterpreted as sensory stimuli that's often innately readable as representations of wherever the signal was originally coming from, say an emotion or a concept or a neurological process.
Okay.
And I just think of it as another form of synesthesia, but I think that happens as a result of the increased interconnectedness.
Mm-hmm. So this is a book called Harmonograph. I mean, it's actually about like this like little device. Is a kind of like two pendulums that you can sort of like connect to each other. And the harmonograph is its own trip, but actually I'm only bringing this book for a different reason, which is that it has like this very nice like table of like resonant modes of a metallic plate. So essentially what you do here, and you can splice a picture of this, even a video. I think there's like videos on YouTube. This is like a metallic plate. And then underneath it, you put a speaker, like, literally, like, could be with sound. You could also like attach it to the speaker. It doesn't matter. Both work. And then you put like grains of sand on top of it. And then essentially you tuning a particular frequency of sound, let's say. And then what will happen is that the plate will vibrate. These lines that you see are essentially nodal points, essentially are parts of the plate that are not going up and down. Everywhere else is going up and down, kind of these like mechanical waves. And that shakes off the sand or the salt. And so like the salt will essentially congregate where the plate is neither going up or down. So essentially a low frequency, that let's say like 20 hertz or something, could like be this particular resonant mode, which really would be like a low frequency resonant mode. Then if you start increasing the frequency of the sound, you will get like increasingly more detailed. And essentially you can kind of like tell what is like the frequency of sound by measuring the distance between these lines, like the average distance between these lines. And these shows exactly that correspondence I was telling you, which is like temporal frequency, like how many times per second it's oscillating, and how detailed the patterns become. And like the reason why this happens is that each of these resonant modes correspond exactly with the ways in which this mechanical wave in the plate can fit an integer number of times in the plate.
Wait, can you repeat that?
Yeah. So essentially, when you add vibrations to a plate, and the vibration doesn't fit an integer number of times in the plate, it cancels itself out. This happens very much, for example, with musical instruments. Like if you have like a guitar string and you pluck it, if you have like a wave that like, is like the ratio between that wave and the actual string is like, like 0.47 or something, the wave will reflect back and get back, and eventually it will essentially cancel itself out because it's just kind of like traveling a bunch of times. But if the wave fits twice exactly in the string, it will bounce back and forth, and it will essentially make this thing that is called a stationary wave. And essentially, like that is the thing. Like essentially, a plate like this will have its resonant modes with their associated frequencies. Let's say like the first one is like 50 hertz. The very cool thing about this is that you can actually add a frequency that is close to it. Let's say like 49 hertz, and you will actually still get stimulated. You will still get the resonant mode that is like closest to it, even if the frequency with which you're excited is not actually perfectly its resonant mode, because you will still have kind of like waves that are pretty close to it, and it's only the waves that are exactly capable of fitting an integer number of times will be actually the ones that survive. It's actually some kind of like it's kind of like a Darwinian process for waves.
Right.
Yeah.
So, are you saying that the points where they cancel each other out are the points where the sand is ending up?
In a way, it's kind of like where the sand ends up is the place where the wave is not going. It is where like essentially the wave exactly is cancels itself out. Actually, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of this in terms of my noise cancelling headphones.
There's some correspondence, but yeah.
Okay, right.
It's not super straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, see, I would expect these to just be concentric circles. So
Yeah,
I can't really comprehend why each one has its own unique, like, pretty distinct pattern.
Yeah, well, they can be something closer to a concentric circle if the plate is actually circular. This is with a circular plate.
Right.
And they actually look kind of like more like electron orbitals or something like that. And actually, in the final analysis, actually electron orbitals are the resonant modes of a field that follows the Schrödinger equation, which is differential equation that explains how particles move in at a very small scale. So even atoms, atoms and molecules are actually stationary points. They're like the resonant modes of the fields as well. Which, when hippies say like, oh, it's all vibration, and it's like actually ultimately, yes. Any pattern that you see in physics is actually, if it's there, it's because it's actually like a good way for the field to dissipate energy. And it's a way in which energy gets trapped in a resonant mode. And essentially, like a lot of like the kind of like work at QRI is like, hey, let's apply these conceptual frameworks to things such as like psychedelic experiences. Where like, literally the symmetrical texture repetition corresponds to a way in which these waves of energy in your visual field essentially arrive at a stationary point or a resonant mode that is very efficient at dissipating energy. And like that's why like it's the one that survives, very similar to like why a soap bubble is spherical.
So some of this is making sense to me
in
terms of how it applies to certain categories of visual effects, namely, I suppose, visual amplifications, visual distortions, and geometry.
Yes.
How do you think it relates to hallucinations? As in, I don't know, meeting entities or seeing figures, because that I tend to think of more in terms of sort of the dream state, like the brain is simulating a concept, and I can see how all this applies to the categories of effects I mentioned, but I'm struggling to understand how it would apply to hallucinations specifically. So wait, do you understand my distinction between hallucinations and geometry?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, totally.
Because a lot of people combine those, and I prefer not to.
So there's some additional complexities here. So the kind of like easiest way to kind of like see symmetry in geometry is just like talking about like, embedded geometry, like what happens in like surfaces, it's like, okay, like the most straightforward. But I would actually claim that even like your representation of a person is actually composed of resonant modes of the field of experience. We're just like very, very finely calibrated so that like we don't notice that actually everything in our experience is made of waves bouncing off each other. Our normal everyday sober simulation of reality that our brain is generating is like very well done, right? Like we don't notice we're in the matrix, so to speak. again, not in a computer-generated way, but like in the sense of like, well, your brain is tricking.
I mean, I see the brain as a computer, so I imagine my reality to be sort of computer-generated, just a meat computer.
Big overlap there. A rabbit hole. I can put a pin in there and explain the ways in which a brain is not a computer, which actually is very, very interesting. I think it is an information processor. It is not a digital computer, and it's not just a neural network. But we can come back to that in a moment.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's just when I think of hallucinations, I'm usually thinking of it in terms of computer terms. Not that I'm an expert in any of those topics. That's just kind of how I sort of frame it. I assume it's just an analogy. But if I imagine a hallucination or a dream, I conceptualize my brain as taking concepts from its memory database and rendering it within a simulation framework. I'm not thinking about builds or anything. I'm thinking about opening up a file, essentially, and simulating it.
So I think there is a lot of wiring in the brain that precisely handles the things such as like file structures and data structures and and so on. But the thing actually at QRI we tend to focus more on is like the rendering process. And the rendering process is based on principles of like resonance and vibration and consonance and dissonance. And I mean, I think this is something that you can actually like experience for yourself if you know what to pay attention to on psychedelics and other states of consciousness. Where let me give you an example. So the feeling of telepathy, right, which I'm sure you've probably had.
I used to categorize it as delusion of telepathy. I've decided to become more ontologically neutral. It's now perception of telepathy.
Perception of telepathy.
Yes.
Excellent. So, so in our model, essentially, every object and every person that you are rendering in your world simulation, you're doing it by combining waves bouncing off each other and finding an attractor state, which is kind of like those Chladni plates. And so actually everything has its resonant frequencies, kind of like, in a manner of speaking, everything in your world simulation has its own sound and its vibe. So what happens is that in normal everyday life, there's like a lot of kind of like tricks and handling operations where the vibes of the different objects are actually constructed so that they don't blend with each other. So you can actually easily, say like, okay, there's this guy and there's this guy, and like they are separate entities, and because their vibe is different, you can store energy separately from one to the other. One of the things that happens on psychedelics is that essentially by energizing the whole experience, annealing happens, which is that the various vibes of their internal representations start to synchronize with each other. And so what happens in the feeling of telepathy is that the data structure that contains information about somebody and the data structure that contains information about you start to synchronize. And when they synchronize, there is a kind of like bleeding or a cross-pollination of the information that was contained in both. And so there's a confusion to like, okay, who does this feeling correspond to? Or who does this thought correspond to? That also, by the way, I think...
Does this relate to mirror neurons at all?
I mean, mirror neurons would be kind of, I would say, like a type of hypothesis for how to make sense of these. But it's not. I think it's not sufficiently general. But yeah, it's kind of in that direction. I mean, like mirror neurons in some sense would be sort of like the parts of the brain that are handling kind of like the synchronization as opposed to the desynchronization. I mean, in some sense, I actually think like a lot of what sober experience is about is precisely desynchronizing aspects of your experience. And psychedelics are kind of like messing up with that very finely tuned process. And then like there's actually like kind of like bleeding of frequencies between things, and like high enough doses, there's this very weird confusion of like, wait, I feel like I'm the couch sort of thing, right? You can blend with the couch, boundaries dissolve. But I mean, essentially, this is guys at home or people at home, like pay attention to this. Like when there is confusion of identity or confusion of boundaries, my claim is that there's always a synchronization process happening. Like if you pay attention to the frequencies, the way things like flicker and vibrate, always when there's a confusion of boundaries, internal temp.
Yeah. Well, I've never had that happen to my camera before, but...
Okay.
So, you're talking about perception of telepathy in a very different way to how I think about it.
Yeah.
So I've always had this intuition that human brains, or maybe mammal brains in general, are prone to syncing up in some capacity,
Yes.
and that perhaps there is more communication happening between us through this sort of synchronization process and subtle body language than we are consciously aware of,
Yeah.
which can mean that we're communicating information on a level that we just don't understand, and that can be perhaps amplified or at least more apparent under the influence of a psychedelic.
Yeah.
And I also think that people tend to just lose, theory of mind? You know, the idea that people can know things that you don't,
Yeah.
or vice versa. And that when that goes, it can feel like you're both experiencing the same thing,
Yeah.
or you're wirelessly communicating.
Exactly.
What do you think about that, and how does that relate to how you're conceptualizing this?
Exactly. Yeah. So essentially, because of this like synchronization process, I mean, the technical electrical engineering term is called increased impedance matching, where essentially like objects or oscillators that are vibrating at different frequencies are more likely to actually like synchronize with each other. Roughly speaking, what I would say here is that usually in a sober state of consciousness, you have like a set of discrete buckets that contain separate information, kind of like different processing streams. I estimated they're like about 7, and like it's very hard to count because like they're not explicitly represented, but I think they're always there. And on psychedelics, essentially, I think you have like fewer buckets because they're like actually cross-bleeding and synchronizing more with each other, but they're larger buckets. At the peak, you know, like an ego death experience of a certain type, or 5-MeO DMT for most people, I know some people react atypically to it, it can actually all become just one bucket, where like it's all synchronized and it acts just as a unit. Actually, jhanas, the advanced meditation states, are also like that. You get kind of these like, there's only just one vibration and it's all just that, like the Om of Hinduism or whatever, the sound of the universe or whatever. That is like when you get just one bucket. But yeah, on psychedelics, typically, I mean, let's say like 200 micrograms of LSD or something, like, well, okay, rather than 7 buckets, maybe you have like 4 or 5. And so you actually don't have enough buckets to represent a social situation like you would. And it like, instead it's like, oh, these two persons feel kind of like merged, and these two persons feel like merged, and I feel merged with the group mind sort of thing. Like, and essentially, yeah, there's kind of like more cross-bleeding. It's more difficult to keep information separate, essentially.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I sort of think of the brain as this sort of engine that takes in sensory input and then tries to separate it into categories and then subcategories. Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, we apply labels to it, but I suppose that might be more of a cultural thing. But yeah, I do get the impression that it does kind of just sort of break down and collapse at higher states of the psychedelic experience.
Yes.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
But why are there only... What do you mean seven buckets? Why 7? Where are you getting this number from?
Well, there are approximately like 7 working memory slots. There's like kind of like a piece of evidence. You know, like if you ask like people to like keep like memorize like various numbers, like very quickly.
There's a certain amount of chunks that people can remember. It's like I can't remember the specific number. It's like plus minus something or other. Yeah.
7 plus minus 2.
Right.
Depends on the person. I think in general, for example, people who are like very naturally empathetic and intuitive, they naturally tend to have like fewer buckets that are larger. People who are like extreme systematizers and autism tends to have like more buckets, but they're smaller.
That's probably me, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so I think, yeah, there's like a diversity in people. And essentially, yeah, I think like on psychedelics, kind of what happens is because of the energy and the way the energy dissipates, and the fact that synchronization is a way by which energy can dissipate more efficiently, there's a general tendency for buckets to become fewer but larger. And
by buckets, do you mean overarching categories?
Overarching resonances in the nervous system that are not bleeding into each other. So it's kind of like, if you listen to music and try to pay attention to like the elements of music, I mean, maybe a very talented musician can break it down into like further parts, but generally it's kind of like, I can notice the bass, and then I can also notice the vocals, and there's like maybe some treble, and then there's also like a saxophone, and like there's, and then like some of them bleed together. It's like, actually, like the flute and the violin just feel like one thing, because I'm just too busy segmenting it in the other domains to kind of like be able to separate those. So something like that. Like you're always breaking down your experience into something like 7 channels that are going on.
Okay, I think I get what you're saying. So it's just like how many, I guess, like categories or subtypes of, I guess, experience that your brain can simulate at once?
Yeah.
Right.
Without them bleeding into each other. Yeah. I think of it.
Okay.
Like one way maybe of describing it is like how many vibratory channels can you keep separate at once? Channels of vibration.
I'm curious how I could even count that.
The thing is, like, for me, the thing that allowed me to kind of like get an intuitive sense of the number was jhana practice, especially on retreat, where essentially what starts to happen as you get closer to the jhanas is like they start collapsing, and you can experience these like very clearly. It's like, okay, like you're deep in meditation is like, okay, now there's only 3 channels. There's the channel of my body and how it vibrates, the thing I'm paying attention to, and what's called like a nimitta, is like a secondary kind of like object of attention. And like for a while it's like, okay, there's like 3 things, and there's only 3 things in my experience, and then like you get like a little bit distracted, and like, okay, that breaks down into 2, that breaks down into 2, and like now it's like, oh, I'm normal experience. And just like the process in which it broke down kind of gives you a sense of like, oh, there's like, I don't know if it's 7 exactly, but it feels like it's kind of like in that range.
And I mean, it sounds about right, I suppose. Yeah. I'm just trying to pay attention to how many things I can comprehend at once. Yeah. Right now, I suppose I'm trying to pay attention to what you're saying. I'm trying to pay attention to my vision, and then I'm also paying attention to just the situation as a whole. So just like being aware that there's a camera recording me, like being aware. What is the time? That's something I was wondering about. Is it actually 7:20?
No, it's 4:30.
Oh, okay. 4:30. All right. Well, that's fine. So, I mean, that's only like 3 things.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, but even within those 3 things, well, there's other things. For example, like your feeling of like being seated, for example, and maybe you're monitoring something like your hunger or thirst or something like that. But we're constantly shifting. I mean, like it's more like 7 at any given point in time. Probably the number of things you're actually paying attention might be something like 30 over the course of several minutes. But you're kind of like flickering between them, like you're going in and out. But yeah, the really interesting. Really, really interesting things happen when you actually have like only like 1, 2, or 3. Especially like one is like when you have like mystical experiences, jhanas, like super blissful states, orgasm if you're like really into the experience, very immersed into it. Like very intense pain can actually take you to just like 1, like if it's like sufficiently strong. But I think most people actually will struggle a lot to just make it 1, and will typically end up in kind of like 2 or 3. And like the jhana practice takes a while. Like I think like strong piti, what's called like body pleasure or happiness, and sukha, happiness, usually will happen when you have like a 2 or 3. But then an actual jhana is like when you collapse to 1, and it's like a phase transition. It's like there's like you've got it. Like okay, now you're in a jhana. Yeah. Right.
So when I'm going through ego dissolution, particularly in the form of, I guess, absent selfhood, I feel like there is just one, and it's just a vague conception of awareness.
Yeah, sure.
Or just my current sensory input. Yeah. And that's it. There's no interpretation of it or anything like that. I just am my sensory input, and there's nothing more to it.
Does it feel... And yeah, that can manifest in many ways, but like, have you ever, for example, felt like you're just kind of like, you are kind of like your wave, the wave of awareness? Like you are kind of like bottle of experience. And like,
yeah, that sounds just like a different way of wording the same thing to me, yeah.
So yeah, that would be when like the bucket is just 1.
Okay. Because there are other forms of, say, ego dissolution, unity and interconnectedness being one of them, where my sense of self gets applied to my internally stored model of reality, and I feel like I am the entire universe experiencing itself.
Yeah.
But during that state, I'm not really sure it impacts the amount of, I guess, chunks or buckets that I can currently conceptualize. It's just that my sense of self has expanded to include more things than it did previously.
Yeah. I would say it probably has affected the buckets, but maybe it's more kind of like there's 1 large bucket, and then there's like maybe like additional 3 or something.
Yeah.
Have you ever experienced like becoming just a point? like either like high dose ketamine or high dose LSD, for example.
Becoming a point?
Collapsing into just one point. No,
I don't think I've ever experienced that.
Okay.
So usually when I'm going through ego dissolution under the influence of a psychedelic or a dissociative, there's a lot of content. So I'm not processing it, I'm not interpreting it, but there is just an endless stream of geometry and hallucinations, or with dissociatives, I mean, it's typically floating through, the void with these vast hallucinatory structures, and I'm not thinking anything about them, but there's a lot of content. There's no, I wouldn't say I feel like a singular point.
Okay. Yeah.
In fact, I don't think that's even contained within the subjective effect index, so I'd probably be curious to figure out what that might be.
Yeah, I've talked to people for whom it's happened, and...
Does that happen on 5-MeO-DMT?
Yeah. I associate it more with high-dose LSD and high-dose ketamine, and it's pretty unsettling, actually. Like, well, I think it's very high valence intrinsically, but then, like, the feeling is very unsettling. Also, I know that some Buddhist meditators, they also experience these.
Yeah.
And it's actually one of the CDs, like one of the quote unquote like powers, which I think are like different kinds of hallucinatory states. But being one point, the reason is unsettling, I think, is that like you completely forget who you are, and you feel like you realized again that you're like the one electron in the entire multiverse, and like when you're in that one point, you don't know who you will be next or what will happen next. Because it feels like, oh, you kind of like popped out of eternity and you're just like that one point again. And so like it's unsettling because like, am I gonna go to like a hell realm or a heaven realm? It
sounds like a solipsistic ego death.
Yeah, it's absolutely solipsistic ego death, 100%. Yeah.
So when I'm going through ego dissolution, I have no conception of who I am or anything like that. So I'm chronically depersonalized. I don't have a sense of self.
Right.
Like I'm talking right now, but it just feels like a pre-programmed response to sensory input. I can't move my hand in front of my face and feel like I'm doing it.
Okay.
It just feels like it's happening. I'm literally an NPC. So that's kind of impacted how I've interpreted ego death over the years. I used to think that ego death was an extension of purely long-term memory suppression because I don't have a sense of self or identity. I only know that I'm going through ego dissolution when I can no longer remember my own name.
Yeah.
But other people, it's like a stable sense of identity that is collapsing. It's not just a removal of their ability to recall who they are.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that might be impacting how I'm undergoing these experiences.
Could be. I wonder. Have you had like solipsistic ego deaths?
No. So when I'm going through ego death, I can't remember who I am. I have no conception of anything. I have no access to any of my long-term memories. And there's, as I said, like a lot of hallucinatory content. And if I push it beyond that, which I've certainly tried to, it's just passing out. Like, it's just unconsciousness. It's a complete amnesia.
Interesting.
So if I go beyond complete ego dissolution, my brain just shuts down and I pass out.
Okay. Which
I've done plenty of times.
Yeah. So you don't feel ever like you are the only like subject of experience and like all of the universe is just you and like you're alone? Is that an experience you've had? Some
experiences that I've had are this is a subjective effect I've been thinking about recently. It's sort of a reduction in a feeling of environmental continuity. So I might feel like nothing outside of my current sensory input exists, which can often lead to the feeling that my bedroom or my apartment is just a spaceship floating in the void. But it never continues to collapse down into a single point or anything like that. I don't know if those are related.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. You know, I mean, the thing that this makes me think of is, yes, the stages of insight, like in some of the Buddhist models, and also Roger Tisdale, which you actually briefly talked to, I think, in one of the, what is it called? Phenomenology clubs. Mm-hmm. But essentially, he describes kind of like, at least in his experience through meditation, like 5 stages, which was like normal everyday life, then identifying with the witness of experience, then what he called like God mind, or like becoming one with everything, then no self, which actually sounds kind of like what you're maybe experiencing, like just there's just no self. So like
absent self is how, but I mean that means the same thing. It's just basically a synonym.
Yeah, because I think like whereas like the God mind level would be more like anything you experience, you feel it as a facet of you?
Yeah, I would categorize that as unity and interconnectedness.
Okay.
So there's losing your sense of self, and then there's having your conception of yourself being expanded to include concepts that it didn't previously include, which at higher levels leads to, I don't know, becoming one with the universe or becoming one with God, things like that. Yeah. So that sounds like a very similar ontology of ego dissolution.
Yeah. And then the fourth path, which would be like the fifth level, there's some kind of like geometric or topological rearrangement of attention and awareness where actually not only there is no self or absent selfhood, there's also no center of attention, which is apparently also like that feels way better. It's like a much more pleasant way of living, which it sounds like maybe you're not experiencing that, would be my guess based on the description, but I don't know.
I don't think so. I mean, is that another subcomponent of ego dissolution?
So the way people describe who are like in that state of consciousness, the way they describe it is that the visual field, it never feels like they're paying attention to one thing and then another thing. It feels like they just see the whole visual field at once, clearly and crisply.
Oh, I absolutely have definitely had that. I've had, I suppose I interpret them as sensory amplifications. I feel like usually, I don't know, I have a peripheral vision and I'm comprehending the thing that I'm looking at, but if my sensory filtering shuts down due to a psychedelic perhaps, then I can be aware of all of my senses simultaneously, which can be kind of uncomfortable and overwhelming, and it often feels like it's very much at the expense of other cognitive processes, because it can lead to my ego shutting down because it can't handle it, I suppose. It just feels like an overload.
Yeah.
Is that the same thing?
I think it's very related. I think like in their case, it's something like they have stabilized that and then made it pleasant, and also just like learned to live with it. And like it's actually they describe it as like a huge upgrade in how they feel.
Okay.
And it comes with a lot of like sensory clarity and like very enhanced perception all the time.
Somebody with a lot of sensory issues, presumably due to autism, that sounds terrible.
Yeah.
How am I supposed to focus on anything if I can't shut out at least some of my senses?
It's a very good question. I don't know.
Okay, interesting. If you could have all of the senses coming in at once and you could comprehend them all at once, then sure, I could see it being fine.
Yep.
But I guess if all of my senses are coming in simultaneously, I cannot comprehend all of them simultaneously. It's too much. There are too many buckets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. There's, and I mean, ultimately, I think it's something like a harmonization process when it is like having that quality of attention, but then on top of that, like it being hyper harmonized, and then it feels very good.
Okay.
I mean, like they do describe it as like their baseline everyday moment to moment experience is like better than like MDMA, just like without like no deeps and like huge reduction in suffering overall. Yeah.
I mean, that does sound nice.
Yeah.
Certainly can't relate.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious. Actually, yeah, like, does MDMA make you feel good?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, of course it does. Yeah.
I don't know. There's like a subset of people that just like.
Okay, no. MDMA feels amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the come down isn't great, but.
Yeah. How many times have you taken MDMA? If you don't mind me asking.
Too many to count.
Okay.
Especially as a teenager.
Yeah.
I don't really trip as much these days, but as a teenager, I was all in for better or worse. Yeah, I have a lot of terrible sex gremlin stories from my younger days. Okay. Yep.
Okay, so here's like a phenomenological, very interesting. Like you were talking about like MAOIs giving kind of like ayahuasca shimmer or like ayahuasca like feel to any other psychedelic.
Yeah. So I mean, like, Syrian rue is the main one that I've experimented. Plus, just because harmala alkaloids, which I think are present in Syrian rue.
Okay.
I mean, they interact with DMT visuals to make them more. So I always interpret it as more ancient and more tribal in just general vibe, and it will do that to other psychedelics as well. So it will do that to LSD or psilocybin. It also doubles the potency at the cost of inducing significantly more cognitive impairments. So I find that my ability to have a short-term memory, or things like that is just gone when I combine Syrian rue with a tryptamine or a lysergamide. I don't think it's safe to do it with phenethylamines. At least I've heard mixed reports on that. I'm not messing with it. And yeah, so I could have visuals that are proportionally as intense as they would be on a different equivalent dose, but I needed less because the Syrian rue doubled the potency. But in comparison to that equivalent dose, I have way more cognitive impairments, but then also the visuals kind of change in character, and it does feel a lot more ayahuasca-like.
Yeah. Okay. So overall kind of, this like lens of like vibration, consonance, dissonance, and resonance that I've been talking about is that it also gives us kind of like a lens for like understanding that type of effect. And also along in the same category, I would put kind of like adding MDMA to things. That like Stephen Lehar, who is crazy cognitive scientist that we reference a lot. The way he would describe candy flipping is like, you get kind of like the same kind of like intensification of experience and like symmetrification and so on of LSD. But then on top of that, you get like MDMA that kind of like shakes your experience in a very relatively fast, but also like very like soft way. And so the sharp edges of MDMA actually become like kind of like soft and creamy and kind of like rolly and more pleasant and
by sharp edges, do you mean uncomfortable physical side effects, or are you talking more about like a sensory aspect?
Both.
Okay.
But even just like at the visual level, that like on LSD you can have like very crisp, like sometimes like very crisp, very beautiful, highly detailed outlines. But then on MDMA, essentially that kind of like goes away because you also have like these like soft vibration on top of that kind of like blurs the edges a little bit.
So when you say vibration, are you referring to when your eyes literally vibrate under the influence of MDMA, or are you referring to something that's more happening within the brain?
Yeah, exactly. So here's the thing. Stephen Lehar claims that the nystagmus, or I forget how.
Nystagmus. That's not how you pronounce it.
No,
but
okay.
I can visualize how the word is spelled at least.
So he thinks that like actually that is just kind of like that's a very generalized thing. Like he thinks that actually MDMA, like it does that to the eyes, but also to like your like tactile feelings and also the auditory domain. And he thinks that's actually like load bearing. Like that actually is like one of the main things that makes experience so pleasant. Is like this kind of like little generalized kind of like vibration actually applies kind of like a filter. I mean, in signal processing terms, it's kind of like a low pass filter that like blurs out the sharp edges and like makes it all kind of like more creamy and soft.
I mean, I always interpreted the vibrating vision as just overstimulation, I suppose. But then again, why doesn't it happen with dopaminergic stimulants as much?
Right.
It seems to specifically be a serotonin thing.
Yeah.
Is this the whole tension having to be offset somewhere else thing that you were talking about earlier?
Maybe, a little bit, like dissipating stress.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like people report like on MDMA, like the whole body can vibrate as well.
Yeah, I definitely experienced that.
Yeah, and I think it's not. I don't think it's just kind of like a side effect. I think it maybe to some like even at relatively low doses, I think that is also happening, just like kind of in the background. And I think like that. Well, I suspect that might be why the experience is more pleasant because it's removing sources of like blockages and tensions and like symmetry breaking points and discontinuities.
Now that you mention it, I do get that effect on psychedelics as well, and it does feel pleasant. Like if I let my body vibrate, it will continue to vibrate. I also often notice I'm tripping because if I put my hand on, say, my leg or something, my finger will start.
Oh, interesting.
And if I just let it just kind of does it automatically, and it does feel good. And if I let it encompass my entire body, it concerns the people around me because it looks like I'm having a seizure.
Okay. Yeah, maybe if you happen to do that again, I mean, definitely let people know that you're fine, but play with it, and that also might be kind of like an in into a jhana state. Like a jhana state is actually not that dissimilar with kind of like a pleasant psychedelic vibratory state where like your whole field is actually vibrating in sync and homogeneously.
Yeah, I'm trying to wonder if it's related to the Hertz thing that you were talking about earlier, but applied to the physical body.
Yes. and envelope, right? Like, because like here's the thing, right? It's like how you shake something. There is like, okay, how many times per second? But then it's also like, are you doing it like softly, or are you doing like sharply? And in general, I think like the more soft vibrations are more pleasant. So that would be called.
So that's what you mean by soft vibrations.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm imagining a curved waveform as opposed to a spiky one.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Okay.
Like unpleasant would be like triangular, or like what? Like the worst is kind of square, which is like. Whereas like the softest is kind of sinusoidal. Actually, it's kind of like ooh. Like there's no sharp transitions.
Yeah.
Anywhere. And the jhanas actually, yeah, like the very pleasant states are actually kind of like doing that everywhere. It's kind of like these like very soft, beautiful, you know, continuous, creamy type of vibration everywhere. Yeah.
Okay. So you're saying that LSD smooths out the waveform of MDMA?
No, the other way around.
The other way around, MDMA. Okay, that I was wondering, because I thought, shouldn't it be MDMA that's offsetting the? Okay, I just got that back to front. Yeah,
exactly.
That makes more sense.
And I think, I mean, I don't know, like maybe I haven't paid too much attention, but like, I think you can kind of like also like rank or describe psychedelics in terms of the extent to which they're actually causing like sharp versus like smooth vibrations. With like MDMA being like way smooth. It has like very, very soft and creamy and beautiful. And I would say maybe something like 2CT2 maybe as like very sharp. And then again, maybe there's like a lot of interpersonal variability.
Would you consider LSD to be on the sharper end of the spectrum?
Kind of in the middle.
In the middle. And okay, can you list some other compounds that are on the spiky end of the spectrum?
Oh, spiky end of the spectrum would be 2CT2, 2CT7.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, DOB. The crappy.
DOB is just boring. I don't know. If it had some spikes to it, it might be more interesting.
And of course, something like NBOM, although I've never tried that and I don't intend to.
Mm-hmm.
But people describe it as pretty sharp, kind of unpleasant.
Yeah, very unpleasant. Okay, I'd probably put 2CE up there.
Yeah,
as well.
yeah, 2CE, exactly. The different, like, I'm very surprised, like, how 2CE versus 2CB are, like, just completely different animals.
Yeah, I really like 2CE, but it's challenging.
Yeah. 2CE also a very unique visual effect, which was kind of like segmentation of the visual field into, kind of like stained glass effect. Like two-dimensional stained glass effect. Like opening your eyes and like, rather than like depth, it's just like, oh, this is just kind of like a surface. And every object is kind of like its own kind of like little part of the stained glass. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you associate this with 2CE at all?
I mean, to me that just sounds like open-eye geometry. I mean, okay. I have certainly seen open-eye geometry that is reminiscent of stained glass, but I don't know if we're talking about exactly the same thing.
Okay. I don't know. There was something specific to 2CE about the visual segmentation that was completely different than any other psychedelic. But
I didn't experience that with 2CE personally, but it is one of my favorites. I get a lot out of it.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't experience anything with it that was truly unique, but it has a lot of features of the overall psychedelic experience that I really like.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've also remember like reading in Arrowweed, kind of like 2CE. Some people saying that like it changes you more permanently than other psychedelics. Is that something you've encountered? That like, people don't feel totally.
I haven't encountered that personally.
Okay.
I'd say the psychedelics that has had the most impact on me on a more permanent basis probably ayahuasca.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. And I guess I mean just to circle back, like I mean like the deep kind of like philosophical underpinnings of Qualia, which I mean this was kind of like a merging of like my philosophy and like Mike Johnson, the co-founder, is like understanding consciousness like as a mathematical structure, but in particular that like what makes an experience feel good or bad has to do with things such as like how symmetrical and smooth it is. So from that perspective, MDMA, like really the reason it feels good is not like, oh, it's serotonin or like, oh, it's like dopamine or whatever. It's more like, no, it's adding pleasant vibrations that are actually like smoothing out the harsh edges. Yeah, it's a very different lens for how to make sense of it.
Yeah, that's completely different. I mean, I can't just immediately start thinking about things in these terms, but I imagine I could probably let it stew for a while.
Yes.
I feel like I have a better understanding of what the hell you're on about
Yes.
than I did before I met you in person, I mean. There's definitely a lot to think about.
That's great. Yeah, is there anything else you want to talk about to wrap up this conversation? I mean, it's been delightful. Thank you so much.
This has been good. I'm trying to think. Like, I feel like we've covered a lot of different topics. I mean, I think we need to be in more direct communication. I can tell that for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there's a lot of overlap between what we're doing, but we haven't really spoken directly before.
Yeah.
At least not in any significant capacity, aside from the occasional like shitpost on Twitter.
Good.
Yeah.
Lena Lol stories. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so it's difficult for me to know what I can contribute in terms of Qualia stuff, because I like explaining things in very simple, communicable terms,
yeah.
and I cannot think in terms of numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm always just trying to think, like, what term is most universally applicable to the general public.
No, that's awesome.
So as just a language, a common language, whereas you're thinking about things in a very different way. I mean, do you have intentions to translate this into simpler terms?
Ultimately, yes. I mean, like, one of the things we're working on is essentially building software for people to visualize experiences more broadly. I mean, the tracer tool is like, I mean, right now, yeah, it's like pretty technical, right? And it's like, okay, you do need to spend a bunch of time like messing with parameters and so on. But actually, what I think it's going to be much more helpful is like once we get a lot more data, essentially we can do kind of like presets, and then people do fine tuning. Right? It's like oh, like choose like the median 2CB tracer, and then you fine tune it a little bit. So like you don't like somebody who's never played with it, like they don't have to like learn like what is like replay and strobe and like attack, decay, sustain, release, like all these like technical things. But in general too, like we're building tools to like, again, from the algorithmic reduction perspective, like visualize things such as like DMT phenomenology from the bottom up with algorithms, and especially with like presets and things like that is going to be super helpful to essentially like have somebody like you like help like develop the vocabulary that people in general will be able to interface with.
Okay, well, if you can figure out how to explain it to me, I can probably assist in the translation process.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah,
excellent.
I mean, it sounds like a good challenge. I'm down for it.
Cool. No, I just wanted to gift you this t-shirt. So, so this one is the 17 wallpaper symmetry groups. So it's like all of the symmetries you can have in 2D. Yeah.
Thank you.
With a QRI logo.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So.
You were applying this to symmetrical texture repetition, weren't you?
Yes.
At one point?
Yep. So essentially, next time you see symmetrical texture repetition, like try to find like, hey, which of the symmetries like you experienced essentially. And
I'll have a think about it.
Yep.
Okay, this is an entire conversational tangent. We could go on for another hour and a half. But yeah, thanks so much. That's really cool.
Oh, you're very welcome. And yeah, let me give you the QRI sticker stuff. And
oh, nice. Oh, we've exchanged.
Yeah, we've exchanged stickers. Oh yeah, here's a holographic one. And also, I'm gonna give you this is a pin of like the Tower of Paradise Engineering, which is like a hypothetical future institute where we research the sort of thing that we're doing.
Okay, cool.
Right. Awesome.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Oh no, this is the sticker I gave Andrés.
Oh yeah,
it's on my business card holder.
It's awesome.
Yeah, there we
it's
go.
Awesome. I love it.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much. I'm gonna turn the camera off now.
Yeah. Awesome.
Cool. I think that's some good fucking comment right there. Probably talk more. Alright, I'm feeling hyped. I gotta get back to the conference.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, this is what I am not complaining at all. This is absolutely worth it. Oh, my
fantastic.
God. Okay.
Yeah, and I think I have to head to a dinner party. So, good timing. Did you feel anything from the cordyceps?